In a world where everyone has a platform and anyone can sound like an expert, how do we know what's real? Dr. Steven Novella joins me today for a conversation about the power of scientific thinking, not just in the lab, but in everyday life. We unpack the foundations of science, why scientific literacy is so important, and how to become more discerning in the face of overwhelming and often misleading health advice. His book, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is by far one of my all-time favorites, and in this episode we use it as a springboard to navigate today's wellness world with more clarity, curiosity, and humility. You've built a career out of promoting scientific literacy and debunking pseudoscience, which are things that I think about and speak about quite regularly, almost in every episode. What sparked that mission for you?
I mean, it's always gone hand in hand with my love of science. You know, even like I remember in high school, earliest days really getting involved in like self-study in science, like going beyond what I was learning in the classroom to like really, voraciously reading, books and articles and magazines and subscribing to Discover, the science, popular magazines that were at the time. And, encountering things like creationism was definitely an early issue, or ESP, Bigfoot, UFOs. I kind of started believing not the creationism part, but believing a lot of the paranormal stuff when I was even younger, like in, before high school or early high school, because to me it was all the same, right? Because you watch science documentaries on TV, in one documentary they're talking about, the dinosaurs, and in the next one they're talking about Bigfoot, or whatever. And it's kind of all seamless to the end user. And even like, Leonard Nimoy and In Search Of and whatever. So there were, voices that my younger self respected that were promoting it. But once I started to learn about like how science actually works, it started to all crumble, right? And, for that, I largely credit, like one of my first influences were a science communicator was expressing skepticism was Carl Sagan in Cosmos. And, once you start down that path of thinking, oh, okay, so it's not all good. Some of it's real, some of it isn't real. And how do we know the difference? Then all of the pseudoscience is pretty flimsy. It is a house of cards, and it collapses pretty quickly. So by the time I was into college, and certainly out of college, was a pretty hardened skeptic at that point. Then my science, my love of science, went hand in hand with the critical thinking aspect of it, and specifically discerning science from pseudoscience.
Do you think there's a level of intrigue and excitement in sort of accepting all of these, I guess, contrarian views as real?
Sure. I mean, I think most people are living, as they say, quiet lives of desperation. And just, our mundane day-to-day life, we work, we whatever, it's pretty, can be pretty boring. And so we're all looking for things to liven up our lives, make it more exciting, make it more interesting, and to feel connected to something bigger, something larger than us, the idea that there is something more to life than just the day-to-day drudgery. And so yeah, that's the thing. That's the appeal. That is the biggest appeal to all of this. And so that's what people fall for. That's the emotional hook. And so it's important, I think, when you're communicating science, and again, Sagan did this so well, to combine, the awe for science itself, because, again, when you really start to wrap your head around what science is telling us about the world, how old the world is, the long history of life and all the things that have gone on, how big the universe is, how amazing it is, the things that are still mysterious that we don't understand. That is plenty awe-inspiring, and it's actually way more interesting than the fake stuff. The fake stuff starts to really feel cartoonish and childish by comparison over time, and the people who are promoting it and really believe in it don't really have good stories to tell. in terms of why I should believe them, in terms of, like evidence or logic or internal consistency. It's all tends to fall flat. Whereas science, real science, once you start to follow it as an unfolding story, you start following the research and following the science news and waiting for that next experiment or the next thing the Hubble telescope is going to discover or whatever, it's way more exciting. So it's important, I think, in science communication, not just to say, oh yeah, Bigfoot's not real, UFOs aren't real, this is pseudoscience, acupuncture doesn't work, this is not right. You have to also say, but here's what we do know. Here is what is exciting about the world. This is actually interesting. Right. So the real science, just way better stories than the fake stuff, but you got to sort of give that to people at the same time. Like this is nonsense, but this is really exciting.
You use the word skeptic a lot. You used it just before, and it's in the title of your book and your podcast. And I believe I've read you kind of clear up the distinction between skepticism and being reflexively contrarian. I think this is important because often the people who take the position that Bigfoot is real, that UFOs are real, are also at least putting themselves in this category of skeptics. So what's the distinction here?
Yeah, so, the skeptical movement, the modern skeptical movement, or self-identified skeptics like myself who are actually skeptical, who are scientific, what we are promoting is what we call scientific skepticism. And that is a dedication to a few things, right? One is just the scientific method. Science is the best way of knowing factual claims about the universe, right? We follow methodological naturalism. We follow, basically a scientific epistemology in terms of how we know what's true. And we don't believe things that aren't supported by logic and evidence, right? We sort of apportion our belief, our acceptance of things to the actual facts and to logic. The second piece is critical thinking, right? Because we all can be fooled. Our brains are flawed, right? We have to fully embrace humility, what I call neuropsychological humility, which is just a recognition that our brains are imperfect tools for understanding the world, that they're subject to many pitfalls, to biases, to bad logic and bad thinking. And also we're emotional creatures, so we fall prey to the desire to believe things that we want to be true rather than things that are true, and what we call motivated reasoning. So you have to understand the psychology and the neuroscience of how we come to beliefs and how we get fooled, and remain perpetually humble in order to make sure that you're thinking clearly. You don't just study the facts and study the science, but you have to think clearly about those facts and avoid being fooled. And then the third piece is just to understand the media and how information ecosystems exist in our society, how that can influence the information that we come in contact with and what other people come in contact with, and influences what they believe. So those are sort of the three legs of the scientific skepticism stool: scientific literacy, critical thinking, media savvy. So that's what we promote. And there's good evidence. I mean, we kind of figured this out by doing it, but there's good psychological research which shows that you do need to promote these things together, and that if you don't, it's not enough, right? If you just tell people scientific facts, it's not enough. It does not dissuade them from believing things that are not true. That's kind of like the 1990s approach.
So people need to understand how we're getting to those facts. So scientific literacy, is that one of the main things that is standing in the way of really combating misinformation and disinformation?
So again, scientific illiteracy is just one piece to the puzzle. And again, if we go back to like what we were doing in the 80s and 90s, for example, and before that, the science communicators were operating under a paradigm that we call the knowledge deficit approach, right? We assume, and again, Carl Sagan, as great as he was operating within this paradigm, because that was the dominant paradigm of the time. And he even said people believe pseudoscience in direct proportion to what they to their misunderstanding of real science. And that's only partly true. That's only true in some issues. You can give people all the facts, but they still will believe nonsense or reject science or engage in denialism if they're not also engaging in critical thinking, or if they're not aware that they are engaging in denialism. They're not aware of how that works. And this is issue by issue. You have to kind of understand, well, why do people reject, for example, the scientific consensus on global warming, on anthropogenic climate change? It's not a knowledge deficit problem. It's not scientific illiteracy. They actually, people who are like really active and firmly reject climate change have above average factual knowledge on the topic than the average person. Not that scientists, not than science communicators, but than the average person. And if you give them more facts, it doesn't dissuade them at all from their belief. There's something else going on. They're living under a certain narrative. And what the evidence shows is you have to not only give them information, you need to give them a new way of understanding that information. You need to give them a new narrative. You have to replace their narrative with the new one, a science-based, a critical thinking narrative. And it has to include understanding of the things that they have fallen prey to, like conspiracy theories and science denialism, and all, a host of logical fallacies that tend to come up. And only if they really can understand those things can they start to deconstruct their belief in, climate change denial. And you're probably not going to get there only talking to them about climate change, because they're going to be engaging in defensive motivated reasoning, right? So you can't teach them these principles in the context of their true belief system. You have to kind of teach them with regard to something else, like find something that they don't believe in or they're skeptical of, or a science that they do think is legitimate, and say, well, what's the difference? Why do you believe in this? Why do you not believe in that? And then, so it's a lot easier to learn the basic principles of critical thinking and how science works and knowledge if your guard isn't up, if it's about a topic that you're emotionally neutral about, that it's not part of your tribe or your identity, then you're free to sort of explore it honestly, intellectually, and understand, oh, okay, yeah, I could see how people insulate themselves into conspiracy thinking and how that can be a fault. And then at some point, either the light's going to go on or it isn't going to go on. They're going to go, wait a minute, is this what I'm doing with respect to my true belief over here? And we've seen people do that. It can happen. But we've also seen people get to that point and have that question. And it's like Theodoric of York from old SNL. I don't know if you remember, that's a too old a reference, where he's like, maybe we need to not believe in magic and elves and whatnot. Then he goes, nah, at the end. And some people do. We've seen people in real time do that. Like the movie Behind the Curve about flat earthers, where they're like, gee, am I doing this? Nah, I'm not doing that. But they kind of get right up to the line, but then they can't emotionally step over it and challenge what has become a tribal identity belief for themselves. So all of these things are operating at once, right? And you need to address them all. Otherwise, you're not going to really be making progress.
So on that topic of humans contributing to climate change, let's just role play this. For example, pretend you and I are at a dinner table together, and I say to you, I think climate change is a hoax. I think it's made up by governments. It's a political agenda. You just kind of mentioned that it's not about the facts. So you're not going to try and convince me.
It's not just about the facts.
It's not just about the facts. So would you start off with me with facts, or how would you go about this conversation if your goal was to try and change my view?
It's a good question, and it sort of depends on what I know about you, what our relationship is, how long-term are we talking about? Is this one cocktail party, or are you a friend that I have months and years to work on, So are you playing the short game, or are you playing the long game here? Are you just in a comment battle with somebody on a blog post or something. So context is important there, but some of the strategies we use, I think the first starting point is to find common ground, right? Just explore, like, are there any things we agree on? And if you can't find any common ground, it's kind of hard to move forward. Maybe you have to get really, really basic. Like, do we agree that science works, right? That science is the way to understand this question. Again, if they reject science, then you're like, there's no point in going beyond that. Like, you have to deal with that issue first, right? So you go sort of as fundamental as you have to until you find an area of common ground, and then you try to build from there. Like, okay, well then, how does science operate? How does it know if something is true or not true? What is the threshold of acceptance? And then you build you got to sort of, not laying a trap, but you're kind of laying the framework to then be able to say, well, if this is how science works, and if this is the threshold of acceptance, and if this is how consensus works in science, then if we plug the facts that we have at hand, and then if you disagree with facts, those can be resolved, right? If there's a disagreement about, like, is it warming or not? It's like, well, what criteria are we using to determine that? And let's see what the evidence shows. Then you can resolve kind of those disagreements, but you got to plug them into a framework that you mutually accept is a way to understand what reality is. If they're operating under a paradigm of, well, I don't believe anything scientists say because they're engaged in a conspiracy or whatever, it's like, well, okay, so then there's no point in me telling you what the scientists are saying. Let's talk about that then first. Why do you think that, and why do you believe the oil industry and not scientists? And you think that they have a conflict of interest, but people making trillions of dollars off of this product don't have a conflict of interest. Is that reasonable? So that's something like that is how you proceed, but it's dynamic. I can't give you a formula. It all depends on where the other person is and how they respond to this.
No, that makes sense. So, I mean, the way that I'm understanding that or hearing that is a lot of that is down to logic. And if you can point out that they have a logical inconsistency in how they're treating two different topics, it gives them something to reflect on.
Yes, and the other thing, don't expect the scales to fall from their eyes and then go, oh, I guess I was wrong. What you're really doing is sort of planting a seed. If you can get them to think, then you have a chance, right? It's, again, not a guarantee, because they may at some point you're basically creating cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance is when somebody's trying to hold two beliefs at the same time that are mutually exclusive, that conflict with each other. And people deal with this all the time. Like, there are things that I want this to be true, but that fact contradicts it. So how do I resolve this? Most of the time, we resolve cognitive dissonance. It kind of depends on how emotionally invested you are in the topic. If you're not emotionally invested at all in the topic and you just believe something that is factually wrong, or it conflicts with something else you factually believe, then you just update your beliefs to whatever evidence you have available to you, right? So we actually are fundamentally rational people. We will follow what we call a Bayesian approach, whereas we have new information, we update our beliefs based upon new information. That's like the reasonable way to do that. We don't chuck out all the old information. We just sort of incorporate the new data, the new facts. If it's a correction of a prior misconception or a false belief or whatever it is, and we just update our beliefs. But if you have emotionally investment, for whatever reason in one conclusion, then that process creates cognitive dissonance. Meaning, all right, the facts are pointing me in this direction, but I really already am lock solid believing in this other thing over here. And so most of the time we engage in motivated reasoning and we rationalize away the conflicting information and reinforce our tribal belief or what we want to believe, our prior belief. So all you could really do in somebody who has a belief or disagrees with you, again, you may be the one with the false belief, right? All you know is you disagree with somebody else. Really, all you could do is create cognitive dissonance, but then they're going to resolve it however they're going to resolve it, right? Either they're going to resolve it by updating their beliefs to a more scientific beliefs, or they're going to resolve it by doubling down on their motivated reasoning and saying, whatever, you're part of the conspiracy, whatever they have to say to resolve that cognitive dissonance. Most of the time people rationalize, they do the motivated reasoning route. Like most of the time people are not able to overcome, again, depending on how powerful the emotional attachment is. But occasionally they do, and maybe it takes time, and maybe they start to see it, or they're talking to their colleagues who also deny climate change, and they start to see the fallacies in them. And then at some point, it may break them down, and they may be able to push through and say, you know what, I guess I've been deceiving myself for the last whatever years. We see that happen too. Can I predict when that's going to happen or not? No, it's all happening in somebody's brain, and it's really hard to know. And sometimes people surprise you, but be prepared for most of the time, it's not going to work, right? They're going to just, you created your cognitive dissonance and they will resolve it. They will rationalize it away and reaffirm whatever their comfortable belief is.
Yeah, it's a form of mental gymnastics. That's how I like to think of it. And what's interesting is, at least from my experience, often when that happens and there is a doubling down of a belief, and you kind of discard this evidence that leaves you feeling uncomfortable. I guess cognitive dissonance it's an uncomfortable feeling. Then people often seek out and find other people on the internet that have that same view, and it becomes an echo chamber, and it kind of just perpetuates and strengthens it over time.
Absolutely. And that's one of the dangers of, the social media, is that it's so easy to create these echo chambers of other people who are reinforcing your tribal belief. And then it becomes like really identity and tribal and community, right? It's like now if you reject the belief, you're rejecting your community. You feel you'll be rejected by your community. And that happens. Some people lose their friends. They lose their infrastructure. They lose that community because they abandon a belief that was at the core of it, If you're a flat earther hanging out with a bunch of other flat earthers, you can't one day just say, you know what, I think maybe we're wrong and the earth is really a globe. That's it. That's a huge traumatic change to your life. You have to give up all your friends, basically. So that is a huge problem. Back pre-social media, when most people got their news from like the television or whatever, there was at least more of a shared reality. There was a common sources of basic information. And now we're not sort of we're not being fed, information that has been editorially vetted to some extent, right? We're not sitting down and watching the evening news or reading the New York Times. People still do that, but I mean, that's not the main conduits of information. Instead, we are finding these communities online that are feeding us curated information, right? So now it's not like just all the information that's out there, or information that is above a certain threshold in terms of its quality or reliability or verifiability. It's information curated to cater to a particular narrative, a particular community, a particular belief, perspective, and that's massively reinforcing. Then that makes people think, well, this is reality. So, we're so politically divided now, partly because you have two groups of people, neither of which can understand how the other group could possibly believe what they do, and they both believe that. And why is that the case? It's because they're living in different information ecosystems. Their realities are literally different, and I'm not saying that they're therefore equivalent. I think, I have personal opinions about which side is closer to reality than the other. But in any case, somebody who, has a completely different, political opinions than you. It's not just that they have different priorities and values. It may be that they really think the world operates differently than you do. They have a completely different set of information that they're proceeding from. And it's true today in a way that just wasn't true 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And it's really challenging because, it's like everything I might say about them, they'll say about me. And it's almost like a perfect symmetry now of just, it's like, okay, we just just that we're swimming in different information ecosystems.
And do people, this is the cynical side of me coming out here, do people really care about living a reality-based life, as you put it, or is it comfort and being accepted by the people around them? Are those things higher on the pecking order, on the priority list?
So, I mean, it is, yeah. So all of those things are true, right? And if you look at psychological research, again, has asked and answered that question: do people care if what they believe is actually true or not? And the short answer is yes, they care. People do have a truth, bias, if you will. We do want our beliefs to be true, and we do not like it when they are wrong. That, again, that causes that cognitive dissonance. But we also want to believe what we want to be true, right? And to meet all of our other psychological needs. And we also want to feel like we have a narrative that is manageable, that allows us to grapple with and understand a complex world, right? And we also want to believe the things that our community believes, whether that's an online community or a physical community. Increasingly, like, Americans are also segregating themselves physically based upon their political leanings. So we actually, if you're a Democrat, you're much more likely to be surrounded by neighbors who are Democrats. If you're a Republican, you're way more likely to be surrounded by neighbors who are Republican. So all of those things are true at the same time. And we know this from neuroscience, like our consciousness is more like a committee, right, than a single solitary voice. We have all these different parts of our brain, beliefs, narratives, whatever, all clamoring for our attention and our priority all at the same time, but something wins, right? And again, it's kind of like chaos. It's hard to predict what's going to win moment to moment. And sometimes people might say, you know what, you might be right, this could be wrong, but then they get sucked back into their comfortable narrative because again, it gets reinforced by other peoples in their community, or they get more information, or they figure out some way to dismiss the uncomfortable information, whatever. Prioritizing the truth, like, absolutely over everything else, that's what a skeptic is, right? So we say, well, we're going to, and this is not easy to do, and nobody does it perfectly, but at least that's the ideal we're striving for, is for whether or not something is factually correct, logically consistent, is the highest priority. I want to only believe things that are true and not believe anything that is not true. And I know I will never get there, but that is the goal that I have set for myself. And that's the journey that I want to go on, and I prioritize that over all else. And that's, but that's a high energy state. That takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of emotional work. It has to take the ability. That's where the humility comes in again. You have to have the ability to say, I'm wrong. I was wrong about this. I'm imperfect. I believe stuff that is stupid. And sometimes I'm just trying to get less wrong over time, knowing I'm never going to get to any kind of final destination of now I know everything, or now I'm immune to being fooled, or whatever. Like, you never achieve that state. It's just a process. But if you don't engage in that process, then you're going to just be stuck in some narrative, and you could be there forever.
I've been using Shopify for over 15 years now, starting with my first online store back in 2008. Since then, I've built multiple businesses on this platform, including 38 Terra, the gut health supplement brand founded by Dr. Will Bolsowitz. Shopify has been the backbone of every brand that I've launched, helping turn ideas into real, thriving businesses that reach customers across the world. And honestly, Shopify has afforded me a lifestyle that I could have never dreamed of, and made it possible for me to pursue the proof, this show, as a passion project instead of something that I needed to make super profitable. Shopify powers millions of businesses globally and accounts for 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From brands like Mattel and Gymshark to founders launching their first product. Want to build a stunning online store? Shopify gives you hundreds of beautiful templates that match your brand's vibe. No designer needed. Need to move fast? Shopify's AI tools help write product descriptions, craft headlines, and enhance product images, saving you hours. And when it's time to grow, you've got built-in tools for email and social media marketing that make it feel like you have a huge team behind you, even if it's just you. From inventory and payments to international shipping and returns, Shopify takes care of the heavy lifting. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your business idea into your first sale with Shopify on your side. Start your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/proof, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/proof to start building your business the smart way. You say that's an energy demanding state because constantly trying to prove yourself wrong is constantly asking questions, being curious, which is the opposite of the path of least resistance being to just accept something.
Yeah. And so, but part of what you have to do, like once you realize intellectually, this is really the only intellectually honest approach to life, is you have to align your identity to that, right? So my identity as a skeptic, as a truth seeker, as somebody who is intellectually honest, as somebody who is logical, is greater than my identity as anything else. And it's also part of it is recognizing the phenomenon of identifying to a belief and consciously not doing it. For example, I do not identify with any political party. I may be registered for strategic reasons, but in myself, I don't see myself and I don't identify to people I know as a label, as an ideological label. Because once you do, you're part of a team. And now you have to defend your team. And you are biasing yourself. And there's no way around that. And so it is so freeing to just say, I'm nothing. I don't have a political label. I can trash talk anyone I want. I can accept anyone I want. I can believe anything I want. I can believe based entirely on logic and evidence and ethics and priorities, and not to defend a team. And that is so freeing. And you could do that for everything, right? You have to just basically do that for everything. It is really freeing to say, I just have to make myself not care what the actual truth is. And part of that is not pegging yourself to a belief, not putting your money down and say, this has got to be true, and I am staking my reputation on this being true or whatever. It's more, I stake my reputation on my ability to change my mind and my ability to admit when I'm wrong, and to really have a very light footprint on any current beliefs that I have. I have to hold on to them really loosely so that I can give them up. And in fact, not only am I minimizing the negative emotional toll being wrong has, I actually turn that into a positive thing because, I have the opportunity to change my mind. And that's a positive thing because it reinforces that I will change my mind when new facts come to light, and I will admit error, and I do, it's also very freeing. The humility is very freeing. It's nobody is perfect. Nobody is free of error. We all can be led to believe things that are not true. And when you accept that about everybody, including yourself, then you're free to screw up, right? You're free to change your mind. You're free to be wrong. You've just made yourself free of this sort of pressure or obligation to feel like your side. You have a side and your side has to be right. It's all toxic. It's all very toxic to logic and reason. So you have to just get rid of that. But that's a process. You can't just tell people to do that and they do it.
Yeah, I think there are some genuine fears that come with that, with what you're putting forward, because it makes so much sense. If you really are interested in the truth, then removing yourself from tribes and ideology and groupthink is only going to be in your best interest. I feel like many people are kind of missing a sense of community. So that's one reason why they gravitate towards those. And I also feel like there's this perception, or conflation, I should say, out there where changing your mind and saying, I don't know, somehow is conflated with not knowing enough, not being an expert. And so in the general public, at least from what I see and hear from people, is that confidence comes from the person speaking in absolutes who has all of the answers. But what you're putting forward here is that someone who is interested in the truth is going to have more humility, is going to be open to changing their mind. And so we should see that as a strength.
Exactly. Humility is a strength, right? Uncertainty is a strength. Doubt is a strength. And rather than overconfidence or bravado being a strength, or not changing your mind, or always being right being a strength. But here's the really tricky part, is that when you, again, this is a never-ending process. When you do that, you tend to then identify with being a skeptic, right? You identify with being a critical thinker. So then you think, well, I'm a critical thinker, so I must be right. And I can't be fooled, because I know how people get fooled and how they fool themselves. And so you have to constantly be reminded of your humility, though, and say, even as somebody who is well steeped in science, who is spent years studying critical thinking, who has really tried to prioritize believing in truth, I still can fail. I can still fall prey, because I have a human brain, just like everybody else. I have human emotions. I have limited information. The world is complicated. We have to constantly be telling each other and telling ourselves this. Don't fall into because that's the ultimate trap for skeptics, is to think that, well, being a skeptic makes me immune. It doesn't. It's like thinking that you can't be fooled by a magician. Magicians love that, because they're the easiest people to fool, are the ones that people who think they cannot be fooled. So that's a constant struggle too. That's a constant battle as well. You have to always, and the humility is the guiding light. You always got to maintain that humility, because when you lose that, you're the game is over. Because that once you have lack that sort of self-doubt and that humility, it means that you're going to be overconfident in your beliefs. There's just kind of no other option. And that's, if you listen to pseudoscientists, gurus, like people who think that they know better than the scientific community, the lack of humility is blazingly the one universal feature that they share. They completely lack humility. And that is their major malfunction. That is almost the beginning of what is wrong with the process. So the other part of that is, you might be thinking like, well, can we never be confident in our information then? It's like, well, you can be, but you don't have confidence in an individual. You have confidence in a process, and you have confidence in institutions, and you can have confidence in the community. No one scientist, no one person has so much knowledge and so much, wisdom, and is immune to these influences that you can trust them as an individual authority. Authority comes from crowdsourcing, right? It comes from lots of people arguing with each other, keeping each other honest, calling each other out, and biases will tend to average out across a community of scientists, a community of philosophers, of people. And not that there can't be groupthink. Again, there's always a wrinkle, right? There's always a caveat. There could be, you have to worry about groupthink as well, but where basically you're a group of people acting as a single entity. But if you keep, that's why you have a community following a process that's capable of self-criticism, that is capable of changing their minds, and they're constantly sort of challenging what they believe against the facts, against reality, keeping each other honest. And that's a well-functioning scientific community. There are pathological scientific communities, but that's a well-functioning scientific community. And that's why science works, because it does all of those things. And it is ultimately humble, which I know is not the sort of image that the public has of scientists. They're kind of seen as know-it-alls. But really, when you're talking to a scientist and you're in the community, like you're in that world, man, humility is always front and center. That because you can't function without humility. You cannot function as a scientist without it because you're constantly trying to prove yourself wrong. That's how science works. Is you trying to prove yourself wrong, asking the people, why am I wrong here? Tell me how I'm wrong. How can I be getting this wrong?
That model that you just kind of walk through of science and when it works at its best, where there's a kind of centralization of information, a consensus, institutions putting information out, relies on trust in the centralized institutions. Is it just me, and you've been in this space for longer than I have, or is that trust in institutions, and here I'm thinking about, cardiology guidelines for, medical interventions and dietary approaches. It feels like there is an erosion of trust in those institutions over the past, 5, 10, 15 years.
Absolutely. I just wrote an article about this on science-based medicine like last week, just by coincidence, that this lack of trust is a core problem. And I was exploring why are we here? How did we get here? And, part of it is, well, why should we have trust in the first place? And again, it's like, yeah, you don't really, to some extent you have to trust individual people, because science is not an abstract thing. It's what people are doing, The institutions are made of people, right? It's like we could believe in the Constitution abstractly, but it doesn't mean anything unless people are supporting it and following it and believing in it. You know what I mean? So science is the same way. Our institutions are the same way. But again, if there's enough people and there's transparency and there's a process and there's self-reflection, et cetera, and there are standards that are objective, all of those pieces are in place, then an institution can achieve a sort of level of trust and reliability that no individual could. And part of that is by admitting error, being transparent, holding themselves accountable, holding each other accountable. All those things have to be in play. I think we largely have those in lots of institutions. I think academic institutions, again, no one's perfect. I'm never going to ever claim that any person or institution is perfect or beyond criticism. It's all a work in progress. But there are some institutions like scientific, professional, academic that have earned a certain level of trust, a certain level of respect for their process, for their rules, for their ethical guidelines, for all the things that make them function as a professionally. And what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years even has been this slow erosion of trust, and it's been deliberate. It's not just something that's just happening in the culture and nobody knows why. This is a deliberate campaign because a lot of people, a lot of other institutions or entities, they are bumping up against these institutions, right? And so I don't know, whoever conscious this is, their approach has been to erode trust in the institution. So like, for example, and this is the main example I used on science-based medicine because it's a medical blog, is the whole alternative medicine movement, right? At the end of the day, what is alternative medicine? What is that? What do you want to call it? Complementary or whatever, all the very shifting labels that they have. At the end of the day, it's about eroding trust in the institutions of science and medicine. That's what they are doing because they want to substitute themselves as gurus, right? As they want the public to put their trust in them as individuals. Not because they're following any process, but because they have intuition or insight or whatever it is. They're just special people that they can know what's right, even when hundreds of scientists are getting it wrong or whatever. They're mavericks or they're whatever. That's their cults of personality built around this sort of guru theme, but if they're being held to objective standards, well, then they can't function, right? If they have to prove their claims with facts and they have to practice within an ethical framework and they need to constantly demonstrate their own expertise and the safety and efficacy of their interventions. Well, they would be doing science if they were doing all of those things, right? They would be practicing science-based medicine. So, but they want to practice alternative medicine, and they need to erode the institutions that are keeping them from doing that. And they have successfully done that. They have eroded trust in experts, in the very notion of expertise itself, partly by portraying expertise as elitism, right? So don't believe those elites, they'll screw you over, right? So don't believe those so-called experts. Look how, and then they emphasize, well, every time we got things wrong. It's like, well, yeah, we admit that we get things wrong. That's part of the process. So it's kind of a no-win scenario, you know? And this is what the fossil fuel industry did to climate scientists. They had a systematic campaign of eroding public trust in climate science and climate scientists, right? This is what Emailgate was all about. It was about eroding trust. You can't believe these guys. They're not trustworthy. They're out for themselves. They're just trying to get their next grant dollar, right? So that's why they're lying. You can't trust government, you know, which is ironic because now the people who have been saying that are now the government, and they're kind of playing this game where it's like, you can't trust the government, but we are the government. But they have to hold true to that narrative. So they invent the deep state, the government within the government that you can't trust, right? So, and this all gets tied in with conspiracy thinking, right? Because you have to engage in a conspiratorial mindset in order to believe all of this. It's like, well, why isn't the media holding them accountable? Because they're part of the conspiracy. Why aren't doctors holding the pharmaceutical industry liable? Because they're getting paid off by them. Like, so everyone becomes part of this global, massive conspiracy in order to explain why you can't trust anybody. So that creates fear and anxiety and uncertainty. And so you look for a safe haven, and then you have the good snake oil peddler selling this comforting package, telling you exactly what you want to hear. Nope, this is simple. It's natural. It'll make you feel good. And you don't believe all of those industrialized medical experts or, you know, elitists or whatever. It's very effective. It's very effective, and it has been working, and it has absolutely eroded trust in all of these things. Not fatally. They still relatively have, like, science and scientists still have relatively high trust, but only relative to everything else, which is super low, you know. But it is eroding, and it's a problem. It is absolutely a problem. It's the hardest problem that we deal with because our message is complicated, right? Our message is, well, it's all nuanced and we don't know anything for sure and we are wrong all the time and we have to proceed with humility. And it's not clean and simple. It's complex and hard. It's like it's hard work. There's no easy shortcut to getting to an answer. You have to do the hard work. And, you know, that's another sort of cognitive dissonance things like, yeah, but people want the simple hack, you know, they don't want the hard work.
That's speaking to me in a number of ways. I recently did a debate on someone else's podcast. I'm not sure whether I should have. I might get you to comment on that after I share this with you. But essentially, I was asked to come on and debate this American doctor who believes the optimal diet for humans is just steak. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. I'd love to know what evidence he's using to support that view. And, you know, I was pretty confident in my position going into it, although there is definitely some uncertainty in the exact specifics of diet. But I feel like there is good evidence that supports a broad dietary pattern. And he was blaming the American dietary guidelines for all of the poor health across America. And I pointed out to him, I said, that's interesting because we have quite a lot of data that suggests a very small percentage of the American public, it's 5 to 10%, actually adhere to the dietary guidelines. So I find it difficult to blame guidelines that people are not able to follow, you know. And from my end, the guidelines, there's room for improvement, but there's a lot of evidence behind them. And really the issue to me seems that the food environment, the socioeconomic status, all of these disparities that are affecting people from adopting a diet that is advocated for and recommended within the guidelines seems to be a more likely explanation rather than the guidelines causing chronic disease. But when I put that to him, he would just go off into storyland. And he wouldn't answer my question directly. And going into the debate, I kind of had this mindset that I don't want to be argumentative. So I probably didn't do a great job bringing him back and holding him to that question and let him go a bit. And I noticed in the comments, at least a lot of people from my community seemed to pick up that pattern of question and then a response with a story. But there were still a large number of people who were convinced by essentially a story without any evidence.
Yeah. So yeah, the debate has been going on for a long time. Like, should we debate pseudoscientists, right? And so I'll answer that question first. The answer is maybe. It depends on a number of variables. One is like, who are you debating and why, and what venue? Who is the audience? Is it moderated and controlled, or is it open-ended? And I wouldn't debate unless you have at least two things. One is you have topic expertise so that you can, you know the evidence pretty well. And two, you know what the other person's going to say. You know the pseudoscience. For example, evolutionary biologists, have many of them debated Duane Gish, who was a creationist. And they, I think they won on points, but as far as rhetorically, they lost the debate. How did an evolutionary biologist lose a debate to a creationist? Well, it's because they didn't know what he was going to say. They might understand evolution, but they don't understand creationism. They don't understand pseudoscience. They don't understand the methods that he's going to use. And so they felt they walked into every trap he laid for them, just because they were knowledge deficit problem, paradigm. They were saying, oh, we just need to give people facts. Saying, yeah, no, it's not what you need to do at all. You need to confront all of the logical problems that are going on and all anyway. So if you're debating somebody on an area where you are confident and you know the pseudoscience, you know the methods they use to create their false beliefs, and it's going to be controlled enough that you can sort of hold their feet to the fire, it can be successful. You can make some progress. The problem is, one of the problems, like what you pointed out, is like they're just using it as a platform to tell their stories. And they're not actually debating you. What are you accomplishing? You're just giving them a platform. They're talking at you, or if they're going to give you what we call the Gish Gallop, named after Duane Gish, where he's just going to throw out 100 misconceptions and you'll get to maybe 10 of them, over the course of the debate. It takes a lot more time to correct a misconception to create one. So if it's open-ended rather than moderated and focused, you can't win because they're just going to machine gun you with nonsense. So yeah, but again, it's also a good illustration of what I was saying. Is here you have a guru, right, who thinks that he knows better than all nutrition scientists, and he has the hack, the simple thing, the formula, and that all these scientists are all compromised. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're making a mistake that he can see through because he's got the perspective or the insight, and right, and it's telling people something. Oh, all you have to do is just eat steak all the time, and you'll be fine. And they have stories to tell, right? They have these, again, to a scientist they sound ridiculous, but they're designed to be compelling to a lay audience. That's what their point is. Their whole goal is not to answer to facts, not to be held accountable to logic and evidence and science, but to tell stories which support their narrative, which support their position as a guru, which support their products that they're selling, whatever the narrative is that they're selling. So yeah, that doesn't sound like it was an amenable venue for a debate. If he was able to get away with that. But that's, what I think you have to be thinking of going in. I've done debates. I've done lots of debates. I think I've won them all, to be honest, just, with all due humility. And that's only because I only go into it when those criteria are met. When I think, all right, this is on a topic I know inside and out. I know the other side. I can almost tell them what they're going to say before they say it, which is very effective. If you undercut their position before they even have a chance to lay it out, then they look foolish, or then it throws them off their game. You got to be operating at that level. Otherwise, you're probably going to get overwhelmed with nonsense.
I'm always on the lookout for ways to refine what's already working and make it better, whether it's in training, nutrition, or recovery. And that is exactly what Momentous has done with their upgraded 100% plant protein. If you're vegan, plant curious, or just trying to find convenient ways to eat more plant protein for your long-term health, this one is certainly worth a look. It tastes great, the texture is super smooth, and the ingredient list is about as clean as it gets. No gums, no fillers, just grade A, 100% pure Colombian. Oh wait, that's a quote from below. But you get the picture. It's made with pea and rice protein, sourced exclusively from the US and Canada, and as always, it's NSF certified for sport. That means that every batch is tested for heavy metals, contaminants, and label accuracy, the same standard that is used by pro sports leagues and the Olympics. Head to livemomentous.com today and use the code LIVINGPROOF for 35% off your first subscription order. Yeah, if some of those are available on the internet, I'd love to put them into the show notes for people to watch.
Yeah, it's been a little while, but I think most of them are somewhere online.
As a clinical neurologist and someone who's just commenting on misinformation and disinformation in general, what are the real world consequences here if we don't get this right?
I mean, there are everything, really. I mean, first of all, if you live in a democracy where you're voting, right, then the public understanding of topics is guiding to some extent our voting patterns, right? So, I mean, again, we could take an issue like global warming again, where, if people understand the science, understand the implications, and vote accordingly, we can get this done, right? We can deal with it. We have the technology. We know what we need to do. It's not unsolvable. It's hard. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's going to be a massive investment, but we can do it. The models show it's like, well, if we just do these things, it'll be okay. If the public doesn't understand it, though, or they don't prioritize it because they don't really get it, or they're being convinced that, oh, it's not going to be that bad, or the scientists don't know what they're talking about, and it doesn't become a priority, then we will see runaway global warming that will have that will cost our society trillions. There's a cost in lives, a cost in money, a cost in quality of life, in disruption, massive cost. And then you can go down every issue. Look at RFK Jr., who is now the HHS secretary. Again, he is just a conspiracy and disinformation machine. He believes all kinds of nonsensical stuff. Again, because he thinks he knows better than everybody else. He has no humility whatsoever. And there's already people dying because of what he's done. There's already a body count associated with that. So we make decisions for ourselves, we make decisions for our family, and we make decisions for society that are increasingly science-based, right? We live in a technological world, run by science and technology, and it's only getting more so and rapidly. Think about artificial intelligence and the impact that that's having on our world, the genetic manipulation. Should we be genetically modifying our crops or not? That's a big collective decision that we're making. Are we going to feed the world or destroy the world with GMOs? I think we're going to feed the world. I think that all, anti-GMO narrative is all propaganda and nonsense, and misinformation and disinformation. I can strongly make that case. And that is directly affecting policy, which is directly affecting people's lives. How many poor children are going to go blind because Greenpeace opposed golden rice on ideological, pseudoscientific grounds?
Where do you think most people get tripped up, if we use this as an example, when it comes to GMO crops? Is it high level that this isn't natural, therefore must not be good?
Yeah, so for that particular topic, that is one of the few topics where it really is an information deficit problem. And it's the one that can be fixed with information. And that's because the anti-GMO attitudes are the result of a deliberate anti-GMO campaign, mostly funded by the organic lobby. Because big organic is a thing too, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And they're like, hey, we could promote our brand by trashing the other brand by fear-mongering about GMOs. Now, they may really believe what they're saying, and I think there is some appeal to nature kind of ideology in there. Of course there is, because that's what the whole organic thing is all based upon anyway. But it's a house of cards built on direct misinformation. And it's pretty straightforward misinformation too. And when you correct that, if people are willing to listen and update their factual knowledge, it does change their minds. So that's one, fortunately, where we can do that. For example, most people think that Monsanto sued farmers for accidental contamination of their farms. Never happened. It's never happened. Most people are shocked to hear that that's the case. In fact, the organic lobby sued Monsanto preemptively, saying they're suing farmers for accidental contamination, and we want to sue them to prevent them from doing it in the future. And in a court of law, they were unable to produce a single case where it happened. So now we're within a court of law, right, where there are rules of evidence. You can't just make shit up, right? And in that venue, they couldn't produce a single case where it happened. All the usual cases that people reference are not cases of that. They're cases of people deliberately trying to basically steal genetically modified seeds from the company. Essentially, all those cases were about one thing, and that's patent exhaustion. They were claiming that Monsanto's patent for their genetically modified seeds was no longer valid because of A, B, or C, right? Because I'm growing these seeds from the plants that I grew, or because, I harvested these from the roadside or whatever. And Monsanto was arguing that that nothing ends the patent, nothing, because once you get outside the patent, then it's over, right? They basically, because seeds are self-reproducing. So if you could endlessly reproduce GMO seeds, then the patent's useless. So that's what the lawsuits were all about. People who were arguing that Monsanto's patent didn't apply to them and their situation. And Monsanto was saying, yes, it does. It was not about accidental contamination. Most people are surprised to find out that their GMO seeds are not sterile, right? They're not like you can't reproduce with them. That was just a lie. That was, yes, they were working on that technology, but they never brought it to fruition. It never was on the market. Most people will be surprised to find out that most farmers don't save their seeds. Why would you do that anyway? It's expensive. It's pain in the ass. If they get wet, they could be ruined for the next year. So it's so much easier. You don't have to separate out seeds and purify them and store them and keep them dry or whatever. You just buy new seeds next year. It's actually cheaper and easier to do that. So, arguing that, well, farmers want to save their seeds and replant them. No, they don't. Not in industrialized nations anyway. They maybe in, other parts of the world, it's different story. But anyway, you can go down the line. Every single anti-GMO belief is factually incorrect. It's factually incorrect. No, there is no studies that show that there's any biological harm. In fact, we have massive evidence to show that there is no harm from consuming GMOs. They are perfectly safe. So, and if you do that, if somebody has the patience and the curiosity to listen to the evidence, to verify it, you realize that there really isn't any valid reason left to oppose GMOs. You really could just go down the line and prove every single one wrong. And so that works. That one topic, that works.
Yeah. But ultimately, I think that last bit that you just said there is really important, patience and curiosity, because that's what we're asking, right? Because if people aren't going to just trust the institutions, if that trust in institutions has been eroded or is eroding, then in order to improve scientific literacy, get people to update, evolve the way they're thinking about these issues across society, it's going, especially when the horse has bolted, like on this topic, right? It's going to require immense amount of patience, curiosity, and humility. Whereas we live in a world where within a couple of seconds, you can share something on Instagram or on Facebook or on X that confirms a belief maybe about GMO crops without any patience or curiosity. And then you're just perpetuating that idea.
So that's the meta question, right? That's the deeper questions. Like on each of these issues, we could say, well, this is, we have to deal with conspiracy thinking, or we have to deal with denialism, or we have to deal with factual misinformation, or some combination of those. But this all assumes that you're dealing with people who have some kind of relationship to reality, have some kind of intellectual curiosity and honesty. And that, so there is, that gets to like, well, we need to support education to the point where we have a basically scientifically literate and a basically critically thinking electorate, populace, people, citizenry. If people don't have a certain minimal amount of just intellectual virtue, curiosity, whatever, it's all kind of pointless, right? Then you're not going to succeed on any of these issues, no matter what strategy you use. But the good news is that most people, humans are a pretty curious species. We do want to know stuff, and we do find things interesting. So there is this sort of commonality there that you can appeal to. Again, you just have to, I think that's why, again, it's important to convince people that real science is interesting. It's fascinating. It's not just some egghead, nerdy, boring thing. It's fascinating. And it has really good stories to tell, just absolutely awe-inspiring. And that's why you have to convince people that, like, being critical thinker is empowering. It's really empowering. It's freeing, And when people get to that critical threshold where they buy into that, then they're kind of hooked, then it's just refining it from there forward. But yeah, you have to get people to a certain critical threshold of respect for truth and knowledge and intellectual curiosity and legitimacy. And then there's also the trust component, which is another thing, because they can have all those things, but not trust anybody and be a conspiracy theorist, and then they're also lost. So yeah, there's a lot of points of failure, which is why, again, our job is really tough. We have our fingers in 1,000 holes in the dike, all at once. Any one of them could be your downfall, But and again, without a decent basic education, again, it's going to be very hard to make any progress.
What would that look like? I think studying the limitations of your brain, studying the scientific method and what it is and what it isn't, how we use it, why we need to use it. This can be years and years and years of work. But if someone was to just start on this, what are the 3, 4, or 5 things that you think someone could relatively quickly grasp that would make a big difference?
I mean, first of all, there's some good primers out there, not to promote my own stuff, but I'm going to do it anyways. Like our book, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, was designed to be your first entry into this world, designed to be a primer where somebody who knows nothing about any of this can read that with lots of examples that most people can relate to say, here are all the pieces, here's why you need to have some basic understanding of science. Here's how we fool ourselves. Here's how we think logically, here's why people deny science. This is conspiracy thinking. It's all there. And then in terms of what would be a good specific issue, that's dependent on the person. I usually ask them, what are you interested in? What do you believe in? What do you not believe in? Let's talk about that. What are you skeptical of? Because most people are skeptical of something, right? So find them and then ask them questions. Well, engage their skepticism. Why don't you believe that? Or how would we know? Or find a neutral topic that they're interested in, right? It doesn't matter what it is. People ask you questions about something, and you say, all right, well, you don't just give them like, oh, this is what scientists have to say about it, right? And again, if you're raising kids, this is this is something that I specifically endorsed and did with my own girls. Almost never answered a question with a fact, right? You answer a question with, how would we know that? How could we know that? What would be convincing? What would be enough evidence? What are the other possibilities? How do we know this isn't true? It's a process, right? It's a journey. And so you have to engage with what people are interested in. You have to engage with what they already believe and don't believe. And you bring out their inner skeptic, right? You got to bring that out, engage with that, show them how empowering it is, make them feel good about the control that it gives them. And it also protects you. It's like, you don't want to be fooled by a con artist, right? You don't want to be scammed. Nobody wants to be scammed, right? Nobody wants to be a chump. It's like, well, how do you not be scammed? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about not being scammed. You do that by recognizing deception. Well, how do they try to fool people? But, and then that's another beautiful entry point. Magic is another entry point. People like to be entertained by magic, but it's like, yeah, but how do you think they do that? How are they fooling you? Do you think somebody could do that and not tell you it's a magic trick and fool you just as well? Maybe to get your money? You think that could happen? How would you know? If you could be fooled by that guy, how do you know you're not being fooled by somebody else doing the same thing, but maybe not honestly for entertainment, but dishonestly to get your vote or to get your money or whatever? How do you know? And there's lots of hooks that you could get to people, but you got to sort of meet them where they live, the more you know someone, the better able you are to do that. But if you don't, like if you're going blind, I just start by asking questions.
Yeah, I was chuckling when you were sharing that about your daughters, because my dad, he's been a professor of physiology for 40 years, and I can just remember vividly any question I would ask him. I would rarely get a fact. I would always be hit with another question.
Right, but that's the way you learn. That's the Socratic method, right? It is great, and it's so much more interesting. Remember when my 4-year, 5-year-old daughter asked me what color dinosaurs were? I could have given her some bullshit answer. The answer is not interesting. What's interesting is, how could we know what the answer is? How do we know from bones what color they were? And then that leads to a discussion of, well, how could we know? It's like, well, we could think about it from the point of view of, what do animals look like today and why do they look that way? Well, some animals are camouflaged because that makes them more stealthy. So maybe some dinosaurs were camouflaged to make them, so we could sort of reason our way to what they might have looked like. We could also, look, it was, and is there a possibility there's any trace fossils, maybe something other than bones that might survive? And that leads to discussion. Well, yeah, some scientists have found proteins, in the fossils, and that are coloring proteins we could say, oh, that protein is red. That would give red color to feathers or skin or whatever. So sometimes we have direct evidence of what they might have looked like. And that's more interesting than just saying, oh, this is what they look like, or this is what color they were.
It's just double clicking on things through a lens of curiosity. And wanting to know more than just the fact that is.
But it's how we know. That's we as we say on our show all the time, we don't tell people what to think. We try to model for people how to think, how to better think, how to think more, consistently and logically and effectively. Obviously you have to deal with facts, right? You can't be doing this in a vacuum. So we work operating within a framework of facts, of information, of data, but you got to be operating in a way that is telling you how to think about those facts, how to think about that data, how to analyze them and evaluate their quality and reliability and resolve apparent conflicts and suspend your belief when we don't know, and that's okay, and put error bars on things like things scientifically. Scientists have error bars on everything, right? Nothing is 100% yes or no. Everything is a maybe. It's just different levels of confidence, and you sort of get people to think that way, not black and white, not yes or no, right or wrong, but just, what are our confidence intervals here? That's it. Just changing the way people think about data, think about knowledge, can have a huge impact. Because if people are thinking about it in this simplistic right or wrong, true or false way, then it's, they're very susceptible. And then when they find out something like that, when they find out like scientists have changed their mind on something, they think, oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's like, no, no, no. New data came along. They adjusted their confidence intervals. That's it. That's always happening. This is not they believed A, now they think they're wrong and they believe B. That's not how it works. They're just, updating their data. That's what's happening.
That happened a little bit in COVID, I noticed, where there was some change in recommendations. And, I even had friends who kind of pointed to that change through really no fault of their own, just not being educated in science, as the government flip-flopping and going back on its word, as opposed to sort of embracing this idea of uncertainty. And as new data presents, recommendations can change. But, perhaps the government could have made that clearer to the public.
I disagree. They made it absolutely clear. They made it completely clear that we had no idea what was going on initially. They were very transparent about that. Like, this is a novel virus. We have no data on this virus. We are building this plane as we're flying it. I've heard them say that many, many times. They said, this is our current recommendation based upon the evidence we have right now, but we don't really know. And they changed those recommendations as new data came up. And they said, this is why we thought that. We thought that, that the COVID was aerosolized more than it was. And it turns out it wasn't. So, the masking is really effective, but social distancing was not that important. Remember, there were all the washing the hands at first. That was like, well, we don't know that it's not transmitted through contact. So, if you want to be safe, you can wash your hands. Then when we found out it wasn't transmitted that way, like, you don't have to worry about it anymore. So again, it's all probability. Again, science works with probability, risk versus benefit, right? Medicine is all about risk versus benefit within a framework of what we know probabilistically. And so, you have to sort of make some bottom line. This is probably right now the best recommendation we have. But again, with massive error bars on it, could they have done a better job of communicating that? I don't know. I was pretty damn impressed with how Fauci and others were communicating the uncertainty and the preliminary nature of the information. The media, not so much. The media gets filtered through a media who is like black and white. So you got to account for that. But it was weaponized politically. It was absolutely misrepresented and weaponized politically. And so it really was a no-win scenario at the end of the day. But if you go back, and again, I lived through it and wrote about it in real time and was following it very closely, they were absolutely transparent about our level of knowledge and uncertainty every step of the way. And even after the fact, like, we were wrong about that. This is what we thought. This is why we made that recommendation. We got more data, and it turns out that wasn't true. And so we modified our recommendations. I don't know what else they could have done.
I am absolutely excited to share an exclusive offer with the Proof community. This is a limited time offer just for my audience, and no doctor referral is needed. Function Health is a comprehensive at-home blood testing service that gives you access to over 100 biomarkers, covering everything from heart, liver, kidney, and metabolic health to hormone levels, inflammation, and nutrient status. That, my friends, is 5 times more testing than the average physical. I chose Function for my own blood work and to be a sponsor of this show because they are the best in the world when it comes to helping you understand and own your health. It's true, the depth and quality of their testing is unrivaled. And as regular listeners of this show will know, you cannot optimize what you don't measure. Don't guess, test. Use Function to know exactly where your health is today, and then intervene with evidence-based medicine and lifestyle changes to feel your best and reduce your risk of chronic disease. With Function, you get access to very important markers like Lp(a), a genetically driven cardiovascular risk factor, ApoB, the most predictive marker of atherosclerosis, and LH and FSH, reproductive hormones typically missing from standard lab panels. It's not uncommon for these biomarkers and others to be elevated. For example, over 50% of Function members have an ApoB level, and over 20% have an Lp(a) level that is above the optimal range. range. You can even add on harder to access tests like cystatin C, a very sensitive marker of kidney function, as well as selenium and iodine, nutrients that are essential for thyroid and overall health, yet rarely tested. So what are you waiting for? Run over to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill today and be one of 1,000 listeners to score a $100 credit. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. I think going a level higher, so more broader science education. So not just we were wrong about it, but having discussions, people like yourself talking about science, that are making it clear that this is not just a circumstance that we're seeing in COVID. This is science in general. Here are 10 things you really need to understand about science that are going to help you better understand COVID.
I mean, it was there. It's not like, the internet exists. All this information was there. It was all there. And I was watching very closely and commenting on and even critically analyzing a lot of the health, public health officials and their interviews, their press conferences, and how they were doing. Some did better than others, right? Sometimes like, that really wasn't a good way to say that, or that was probably going to create a misconception. So they failed there too. I'm not saying they were perfect, but on the whole, they pretty much did what they were supposed to do. I think they communicated on the whole pretty well. It was just that they were again, it's like, are you saying that we should have educated the public about the scientific method and critical thinking and Absolutely. Absolutely. I would wish we would do that, but does that exist in our culture? Do we have, is TV and all these outlets, are they engaged in teaching critical thinking lessons all the time? Or are they just bottom lining it for the public most of the time? So given the cultural context that they were dealing with, they did a pretty damn good job. And it really was a hit job. It really was a political hit job to sort of, create this narrative that they lied and they were deceiving the public. It's all bullshit. It was really just a political hit job. They literally demonized Fauci and tried to make him into the bad guy. But I mean, I lived through it and was critiquing it all the way. And the good ones did a great job of putting it all into context. As good as you can do given the level of uncertainty that we had at the time. But it's a great example of why critical thinking is so important. Because it was so easy to fool people with a narrative of these people who don't know what they're talking about, or they're lying to you for some reason, or they're taking your liberties away and it doesn't really work, or whatever. The political narrative was very compelling, was very clean and punchy, and it's hard to oppose that with, well, we're not really sure, but this is why we kind of think this, and the evidence is preliminary, but risk versus benefit, I would err on the side of being cautious, or whatever. It's hard to, that's where we were, but that's hard to communicate, And
especially if across the population, there is not an appreciation that science is all about uncertainty. And that when someone speaks with uncertainty, this is usually a sign that that scientist is being objective and has humility. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is I just wish people better understood what good science communication looks like, so that then they weren't walking away from press conferences thinking that, nobody knows what's happening or what's going on, and people flip-flopping.
And it wasn't so much the press conference as the commentary afterwards, lying about the press conference. That was really the problem. There's also the angle here that when you're engaging in public health communication, there's a body count that is attached to what you say. And so, absolutely, did they simplify their method for maximal effectiveness at times? Sure, because you have to do that. You can't just go in with scientific level of nuance, right? You have to know your audience, right? When one physician's when I'm talking to another physician about something, I talk about it in a certain way. If I'm giving that same information to a patient, I frame it in a different way. It's not less true. It's not less honest. It's just more, I might be bottom lining it more for them, or putting it in a different framework, or maybe emphasizing certain things in a different way to help them make a decision, right? That's because that's what they're, doing. I'm not just going to just give them a raw data dump, like I might a researcher or a clinician who's not making a decision. Right. And it's just that context is important. So when you're a public health official, you have to be very careful how you frame things. And I think that they were walking that line pretty well of saying, like, this is a novel virus. We have preliminary information. There is some uncertainty, but given all this, we feel people should wear masks, and they, making a very simple recommendation, a sort of a firm recommendation, is the best thing to do from a public health standpoint. But then, of course, it does open them up to later criticism. Masks is still a good idea. It works. The anti-masking stuff is BS. Other elements of it, like, did we need to shut down schools? Well, we don't know what the counter narrative is. Like, we don't know how bad it would have gotten if we didn't shut them down. Or we don't know how much we would have had to shut them down anyway because all the teachers got sick. But yeah, the downsides of doing that is worse than we thought it was going to be. You have to admit that. It turned, the schools were not as prepared, and the negative impact on kids, especially the younger kids, was worse than we thought. We got to own that, right? We made a decision, never, without data, based upon the best, in best guess we could make. And they often said that this is our best guess. This is our best guess. And it often was, and it often was effective. And I think we did a good job of saving a lot of lives, of minimizing spread, getting the pandemic under control, as quickly as we could. Recommending the vaccine, absolutely. Does that mean that we have to ignore the fact that there was, 1 in a million people got a blood clotting disorder? Yeah, you have to acknowledge that was real, but you got to put that into perspective too. You got to, from a public health point of view, you have to say things like, you are overwhelmingly more likely to be helped by this vaccine than to be harmed by this vaccine. That is true. Is that the complete story? Is that like putting numbers on it? No, but that's a good way to bottom line it for the average person. So anyway, it's complicated. And it's so, and again, if you're operating intellectually honestly in the public interest, that's one thing. But if you're weaponizing it for political and ideological advantage, it's so easy because reality is complicated and messy, and it's just really easy to just, to misrepresent it and to weaponize it in that way. And that's what we saw. We're still seeing it. We're seeing it now that Trump is trying to say officially there was a lab leak. There was, that's bullshit. There is no evidence for a lab leak. The medical data all supports a spillover event from the meat market, the Wuhan, a zoonotic spillover. We can't rule out a lab leak. We have to admit that. We don't have the smoking gun, but there's no evidence for a lab leak. That's even the intelligence agency says, it's slightly more likely, but we don't really have any way to prove it. But they're politically saying it was a lab leak. That's now the official answer of the federal government. It's bullshit, but it takes a long time to explain to people what the reality is because we don't know at the end of the day. It's just that scientists have one best guess. The intelligence community has another best guess. I think the scientist's best guess is better and more confident, and that's where we are. But that's kind of it's kind of a soft, nuanced story. It's a hard sell. It's a hard sell.
Is it Brandolini's law? The energy that's required to refute misinformation is orders of magnitude greater, something like that.
Yeah, that's the Gish-Gallop thing as well. Yeah, it's like it's so much easier to create misinformation than to correct it. The truth is a very high energy state again, and people sometimes just don't feel comfortable with the uncertainty and the nuance, right? And you take a complicated, highly charged issue like biological sex and trans issue, and is biological sex binary? And it's complicated, Trans healthcare for minors is a complicated medical ethical question. Do you have a few hours? We could talk about it and I can get into the weeds on that. But it's so easy to say, oh, that's all bullshit. Men are men and women are women, and it's just woke liberal, nonsense. They have a very clean, powerful emotional narrative that can only be countered by an hour-long science lecture, and it's really tough. It makes it very difficult.
Coming back to you as a critical thinker, truth seeker, or skeptic, earlier you mentioned that one of the traps you can fall into is that you may always think you're right. And so you kind of have to check yourself. You have to have some humility always kind of front of mind. What are the main things that get in your way, or what are the things that you're always trying to think about so that you don't fool yourself?
Well, for one thing, it's good to check with other people too, not just check yourself. You keep each other honest, right? It's always good to have sort of that community who, again, will give each other feedback, right? Will call each other out, right? Not just reinforcing each other. And it's good to ask, like, am I the asshole here? Am I getting this wrong? Like, am I going down a rabbit hole, or does this make sense to you too? And I have, you know, again, not everybody can do this, but because I'm an academic and a podcaster, I have I can call up a physicist and ask them, like, am I getting this right? Like, does this make sense to an expert? But if you don't have that, like, if you don't have a physicist on speed dial, you got to find outlets that are like people you respect, and outlets that you respect who are, academic, professional, have a good track record of being intellectually honest. And if you disagree with the experts, you assume you're wrong. And that's a good first assumption. Assume that you have a misunderstanding. Again, always take the most humble assumption first, and always ask the question, all right, but can I be wrong here? Am I wrong here? Just reflexively, you have to ask that question. And just have to constantly be going through that process. There are some areas where I find that I'm most vulnerable to self-deception that I have to really be careful about. And one is I'm very vulnerable to the skeptical narrative, meaning this person is claiming X. X is a pseudoscience. It's complete bullshit. And I'm going to call this guy out on their bullshit, on their pseudoscience. And you can create this sort of clean skeptical narrative of they're completely wrong, they're pseudoscientific. And sometimes, usually, the story is more complicated than that. Not always. Sometimes, creationists pretty much are 100% wrong, right? Because they're operating from a false, premise and false. They're not engaged in science. They are engaged in something else, right? So they've sort of raised being wrong about evolution to an art form. It's really amazing. But a lot of things, it's like, the narrative isn't that clean. Sometimes there are pieces of the narrative which are, like, somebody might have a conspiracy theory, and I want to say every single element of that conspiracy theory is bullshit. But sometimes there's an element of it that's actually plausible. And you got to say, okay, but this piece here is actually, I have to say, is actually plausible. And so, we have to, allow for that nuance and not just knee jerk, it's pseudoscience, it's got to be wrong. Sometimes the people you really dislike because they're con artists or conspiracy theorists or science deniers, sometimes they get things right. Not because they're following a process, just because reality sometimes happens to align with whatever their narrative is, right? It would be amazing if it never did, right? Sometimes it does. Sometimes, yeah, the government did actually lie about that one thing. Or, yeah, that was scientific fraud. It happens. And you have to be, to admit pieces of the puzzle that make your story really complicated and messy and not clean. And sometimes there's a huge temptation to sort of sanitize the skeptical narrative, and we have to be careful not to do that. The other big red flag is when the skeptical story aligns with your worldview, even if that worldview is political or ideological or cultural or whatever. It's like you have to be especially careful that, like, you have to, like, oh, I believe this thing that, the people that I generally agree with believes. I have to make absolutely sure that that's correct, because it's so easy for me to be falling for, following this narrative,
If you're holding a view that is the opposite or different to experts on that topic, you're probably wrong, having that kind of humility. How does that work? Like, let's take a real world example, something that's kind of in my sphere and in nutrition, vegetable oils or seed oils. So the guidelines and recommendations certainly advocate for consuming more plant-based oils or vegetable oils over saturated fats and have for quite some time. But if you were to say, is my view aligned, and I'm not talking about me, I'm just talking about anyone who's thinking about this topic, is my view aligned with experts? You will find experts online who think that seed oils are toxic, and then you'll find experts online who think that they should be consumed instead of saturated fats. So which experts are you cross-referencing?
Choose your expert. Yeah. So that's where it comes to, like, no single expert is an authority, right? No single person is an authority. No small group is an authority. Too, there are also, like, these small groups of scientists who all believe the same thing, or, not necessarily scientists, but, people who are operating in this space. So you have to say, well, first of all, sometimes scientists are going to disagree, and that just means that we're uncertain, or it's genuinely controversial, or maybe it's not genuinely controversial, and these are outliers. Is there a strong consensus and an outlier, or are there two equally valid schools of thought here? And how do you know? You got to talk to an expert, or you got to be an expert, or you got to read someone who can distill that for you, who you trust. Again, there's no simple hack. There's no one rule of thumb or that you could do. Like, each situation is its own thing that you have to invest time in. How much time? Well, how much is it worth to you? But at least like, one expert can be absolutely wrong, right? And even if they're right about everything else, like, I know experts who are aligned with the broad consensus on most things, but they have this one thing where they're an outlier, where they just believe this one thing for whatever reason that's just conflicts with the prevailing consensus. So you have to, that's, again, being a critical thinker, being media savvy, being, scientifically literate means to ask the question. All right, I know you could find experts who will believe anything. So that in and of itself is not valuable. That you found an expert who believes something doesn't mean anything. You have to have a way of evaluating the consensus of scientific opinion. Is there a consensus? What is it? How strong is it? How uniform is it? Are there outliers? Are there minority opinions? Are they valid? Sometimes the minority opinion becomes the dominant opinion, or is this really just cranks who are really far out of, they're out of the mainstream? How confident are the consensus experts that the outliers are wrong? You have to ask all those questions, or talk to somebody who has the ability to ask all those questions and distill it and summarize it for you. There is no shortcut. There's no shortcut there. You got to do the work, and yeah, it's a complicated world. There's no easy answers. Sorry. I can't give you, like, oh, do A, B, and C and you'll get to the right answer. It's like, no, you got to go through the process,
Right. I can imagine people are listening, and I've probably fallen into this line of thinking before, where you just have resistance to this idea of the population at large becoming more scientifically literate. You don't think it's realistic, but then the question is, what is the alternative?
Yeah. The alternative is not pretty. Yeah, I mean, and remember, I started doing this before the internet revolution. Lived through a lot of changes, and the social media and the internet really has created a different world in very bad ways. The information, and I mean, in some good ways too. I do think that people are more knowledgeable, more factually knowledgeable than they were. We have access to a lot of information. There's, the social media has allowed talented science communicators, scientists, to communicate directly to the public. And the public has access now to all kinds of fantastic high quality information. If you are interested in educating yourself about science and critical thinking and all these things, it's all there. It's all distilled for you, packaged in multiple formats, video and audio and books and articles. It's all there. That's great. But it's buried under this mountain of misinformation and pseudoscience and nonsense and commercial speech and all kinds of things that are trying to lead you astray. So right now, the most important tool anyone could really have is the ability to sort of sift through the nonsense to the real information. and have some way of telling the difference, right? That's really the most important skill you can have in today's world, is the ability to tell what's real from what's not real, what's reliable and valid from what's not reliable. And so that's what I think when we talk about we want this to be baked into education, that's what we're talking about. Not what's happening today, in public school, unless there's a good, some science teachers can do it, and a lot of them do it. And you have good science teachers out there who are teaching critical thinking, but it's not baked into the curriculum. Like civic scientific literacy, civic critical thinking skills, like your ability to participate in society, to survive in this ecosystem of misinformation should be baked into K through 12 curriculum and should be baked into every science course. And that's partly part of what we're trying to do, is re-educate the scientists and the academics out there who don't want to teach pseudoscience. Like, no, you have to teach the pseudoscience. It's not this messy thing you don't want to deal with. You have to teach it. You have to teach your students how to recognize it, how to recognize science denialism, how to recognize pseudoscience. Otherwise, you are sending them out naked in front of the wolves. You're not preparing them for the real world. Maybe you're preparing them for the ivory tower, and then even there, it's not really enough. But you're certainly not preparing them for the real world without telling them how to identify pseudoscience and science denialism and conspiracy thinking and why it's wrong, how it operates, all of those things. If you don't do that, then you haven't done your job, right? And no matter how many facts you give them, it's not enough. It doesn't help. It's not going to prevent them from becoming cranks, once they leave your classroom.
Which makes me think about the role of AI here, which you mentioned earlier. So do you think that AI could potentially help by removing certain biases that may be unique to humans, these blind spots that we have, or are we in the same position where human biases can just get in the way of acting on the information that we get from AI?
I mean, it's both of those things, right? It's like if you go rewind 20 years and you asked me, do you think social media is going to be a force for good or evil in the world? And it turns out it's both. And it's really just a matter of how much relatively. I think AI has the power to help us deal with all of the information, to help us sift through it. And it's a tool, right? And it could be a tool that we can use to help us get control of the misinformation. It's also a tool that can be used to generate an unlimited amount of misinformation. And we know that that's already happening. And I think both of those things are going to happen. And it's just a matter of the proportion. Is there going to be enough people using it as a tool to help us control our information world, or are we just going to be buried under an avalanche of things that we can't tell, real from fake? Are we seeing the end of truth, the end of reality, and just the beginning of just an AI generated, fake reality that nobody has any chance of telling what's real from what's not real, where there's no trust. We're all just, just trying to survive, and we'll all just say, oh, screw it. No one can know anything, so I'm just going to believe what I want to believe. Some people are already there. That's already the culture, for example, on certain social media platforms, like on TikTok. There's a lot of great information there, but the overwhelming culture is, believe what you want to believe. It's all just getting clicks. It's all just performance. There is no truth. There is no reality. It's all just performance. And that's very dangerous, because then we're vulnerable, right? So and this is my nightmare scenario. I don't know if that's where you intended to go with this question, but my nightmare scenario is basically what's happening in China right now, where we are creating these powerful tools, could be used for good, could be used for evil, and eventually they're going to get in the hands of dictators and authoritarians, and it's like a game, set, and match, right? It's game over at that point when you have an authoritarian government who can control the truth, can control history, control facts, control information, absolutely, with powerful tools powered by AI. how do you combat against that? How do you exist? How do you push back against a completely all-powerful authoritarian government that we have handed that power to through these tools of information? You know, if we lose our ability to maintain a liberal democracy, there may be no way back from that, right? It may be a one-way ratchet towards authoritarianism. We got to sort that shit out fast, because it's happening now. This is happening right freaking now, and nobody really knows what to do about it. So, you know, at this point, your guess is as good as mine as to what's going to happen. We just have to hope there's enough of a popular pushback and enough people in the, you know, with, you know, the perspective to see what's happening to sort of raise the alarm bells, that we could at least maintain the ability to maintain a liberal democracy, because right now it's not looking good.
I think that's a pretty good place to land the plane here today, and hopefully I can convince you to come back on, perhaps in person next time. And I meant what I said at the outset. I think you're one of the most important voices in science today. I really, really recommend everyone goes out and gets a copy of your book. I'll link to that and the podcast in the show notes. Really appreciate you making the time to be with us today.
I think I'll try to maintain my humility with that kind of feedback. No, I appreciate it. I do.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.